When we scheduled this event some 5 months ago, we had no idea it would be so timely.
More than 600 billion has been poured into Africa since 1960 with nothing to show for it.
Diplomacy can't work without the threat of force. Therefore, it really would be disastrous to diplomacy to say we must tolerate a nuclear
Do you think
rise.
a penalty should ever be levied against somebody who comes into the country?
Each one of us, Heather, said we believe in enforcement. We're not talking about. We're talking about smart enforcement.
But tell me what you would
I think having structured inequality over centuries is inconsistent with the deepest values of America.
One point of agreement that we have is that speech is fiercely powerful and can be intensely dangerous.
Every word said on that score by the first speaker on the other side was a complete waste of her breath.
What a privilege it is to find ranged against me three of the finest minds it's possible to locate among protagonists for a doomed cause.
Intelligence Squared is a series of Oxford-style debates. We have two teams of 3 speakers. Each speaker has 8 minutes in which to make his or her case. Beginning with the proposers, speakers alternate by side until all have spoken. Following the speeches, the moderator will bring in questions from the audience, and we conclude by allowing each speaker a 2-minute rebuttal.
The real shame here, the real sin here, is for the first time in history, Palestinian and Israeli kids aren't going to schools together. They're not spending time together. They're not falling in love together. They're not doing businesses together. And the problem is the walls of labels are keeping sides apart. People say Hamas is a terrorist organization. I say Israel's a terrorist state. Who cares?
Actually, all anybody really wants to do is talk about it. They don't actually do anything. And the evidence for that is the number of major leaders in climate who clearly have no intention of changing their lifestyle, reducing their own consumption, or getting off private jets themselves. If they're not willing to do it, why should anybody else?
Our opponents will rail against so-called preferences for students of color while they ignore the preferences built in for whites. So they condemn the University of Michigan for giving 20 points on a 150-point scale to students of color, but they ignored the points that were in practice essentially for whites only. Like the 16 points you got if you were from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The snow is not the only thing white there. The 10 points just because you went to a top high school, which means your parents lived in the right zip code. The 8 points for taking advanced placement classes, which are 3 times more available in schools serving white kids than schools that serve mostly students of color, or the 4 points you got if daddy went to Michigan.
I also want to go back to address something else that was said, this idea of this testing. Look, right now, these are the tests that we're using. And I want you to listen very closely. What we're talking about, oh, the test, not the preparation, and on and this. The underlying message is that our kids can't compete, that my 3 sons cannot compete, and I don't buy it.
Early in my career, I penned this badly drawn cartoon, Fundamental Sex Ed, Does the Stork Bring AIDS and Herpes Too? I expected calls from the fundamentalist ministers in the area, but no, I got calls from school teachers saying, not all teachers are fat, old, and carry rulers. And school teachers aren't alone. In the course of my 25 years as a paid professional offender, I have been attacked for criticizing people of color, people without much color, people of guns, people of excessive weight, people with trial lawyers, and Armenian people. This is a partial list and certainly doesn't begin to cover people of religion, who are the touchiest people of all. Since our opponents have referred to the 9/11 Commission report, I have to say that I read that report completely differently. Out of 41 specific recommendations of steps we should take to prevent another 9/11, almost none of them have anything to do with increasing the government's surveillance power. And unfortunately, according to the report with letter grades that was issued a couple of years after the initial recommendations, the government got D's and F's on most of the very significant concrete recommendations.
I want you to note, as you think about how you're going to vote, both the abstract and the radical character of the arguments of the people on the other side. They're abstract in that they have not given you one example of what you yourselves as individuals ought to be afraid of. What is this tremendous incursion? And I ask you, as you think about this, to think, do I feel less free to speak my mind? Do I feel that there are secrets that are important to me that are more in danger of exposure now than there were before? And then I ask you to consider, how many terrorist attacks have there been on U.S. soil since 9/11, and what is the terrible record through the 1990s, from the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993 to the attack in 2001?
When America goes into a country like Afghanistan or Iraq, you don't do the things which previous great powers did. That the moment, if anything, this is a failing. If anything, when you go into a country like Iraq, you don't say, how long can we stay here, but how soon can we get out? You want to dabble as little as possible in the world. I think that's a virtue. You know when you have to intervene, but you also know when you have to get out.
Do you think a penalty should ever be levied against somebody who comes into the country?
Each one of us, Heather, said we believe in enforcement. We're not talking about. We're talking about smart enforcement.
But tell me what you would do if somebody comes into the country illegally.
I talked about wage and hour, health and safety. I talked about
that's not
if we're going to do deportation. I don't think it should be by raiding people, pre-dawn raids, with people wearing cowboy hats, carrying machine guns aimed at children.
So should
I
the
don't
raids
think
be
that's
at
who
noon?
we should be as a
Should
nation.
people wear different kinds of hats? I mean, I think it's a legitimate question. I mean, I'm not trying to make a joke here, but
that's Mark Krikorian.
I have to say, and I've been doing this now for more than 12 years, specifically in this job, and I've got to say I have never heard someone on that side of the debate say, yes, this specific enforcement action, and I'm not talking about, criminals, drug dealers or something, regular immigration violation, that this specific enforcement action is okay. This I approve of. I've never found a single
Mark, that is not,
Mark,
that is not true.
We
supported comprehensive reform,
Let Karen finish and then Daniel.
Yeah, which had tough employer sanctions,
I'm talking about
but they were done
enforcement,
reasonably.
Not promises of future enforcement. Is there anything that's ever happened, any enforcement action in the past, say, 20 years, that anyone on your side would be able to say, yeah, okay, that's good enforcement. That I'm all for.
It's now time for you to decide who carried the day. Once again, please pick up the keypad that's attached to the left armrest of your seat.
And now, the debate results. After our debaters did their best to sway you, you voted.
In terms of opinion change, those in favor of the motion have carried the day. Congratulations to the team for the motion.